chapter, John has moved to discussing what knowing God means and what loving God entails. Increased fellowship with God should also be an increased knowledge of God. An increased knowledge of God should increase our love for God. You see, these are extremely important themes and topics throughout the Johannine epistles. He talks about fellowship 4 times in the book, and all 4 of those times are in the very first chapter. He talks about knowledge at least 39 times throughout the book of 1 John. So knowledge is extremely important to John, but the most frequently used word throughout this epistle that you're probably not very surprised is love. Love is used 46 times in 1 John. So those are our 3 main ideas or thoughts so far in this book: fellowship, knowledge, and love. And for John in this passage, 3 through 13, he really stresses just how integral those are to each other, just how important those 3 feed off each other. And so that's what we're going to be looking at this morning. John argues is that to have an intimate relationship with God, you have to be obedient as well as renounce sin. And so John asks a question in verses 3 through 4. Let's go ahead and let's read those verses together. And by this we know that we have come to know Him if we keep His commandments. Whoever says, I know Him, but does not keep His commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. And so verses 3 through 4, John asks a question, or I would like to ask you a question this morning. How do you know that you know God? Or how do you think people would answer that question? How do you know that you know God, or that you have a relationship with Him?
The Scriptures.
Okay, Scriptures, right? We look at the Scriptures, we read it, we see what it says. According to that, we have a knowledge of Him. Brother Austin? By keeping His commandments, obedience, right? And that's what John is going to stress, right? Obedience is how we know that we know God. What are some other comments that maybe you wouldn't give, but that maybe somebody in the grand realm of Christianity might give? Knowing God. That's right, John 14:15, right? And so, absolutely. And so we see John is consistent in that claim. But what would some of our friends say? I go to worship. How do you know that you have a relationship with God? Or how do you know that you know Him? I go to church. Maybe twice a year, but I go to church, right? Yeah. What else? I pray, right? I talk to Him. What are some other things you've heard? Yeah. Me and God have an understanding, right? We came to understanding, a long time ago, and we're good with each other, right? What else?
When you have that peace that passes understanding.
Yeah. I've got this feeling, right? I got this feeling. I had a teacher when I was growing up who used to always tell his friends, how do you know it's not gas? It's like, how do you know God? I feel it right here. He's like, how do you know it's not, last night's beans? Someone recently told me, I know because I know. And I pressed him on that. I said, well, explain to me how you know. He said, I just know.
So John's word for knowledge is one that is studious, not just I feel or I think.
Yeah.
One who delves in and one who spends time with.
Yeah, well, it's both, right? He uses gnosis 24 times in 1 John, right? And that is the experiential knowledge, right? The knowledge that comes by doing something. He also uses oida 15 times. That is the theoretical knowledge, right? The idea of knowing in your mind intellectually. And so, yeah, John sees a distinction between the two, right? Sometimes in our culture we have a hard time seeing that, but John plays that up in this passage. He says that if you want to know that you know God, if you want to know that you know God, you've got to do what? What does he say in verses 3 through 4? You got to keep His commandments, right? Is obedience important to John, the apostle of love? Yeah. He says in our passage that you can't know God without obedience. You can't love God without obedience, because to be void of one is to be void of all 3, right? They're such an integral part of each other. You cannot have one without the other. You can't say, oh, I know God, and then go live in a way that transgresses God's law.
Disobey is to put yourself at odds with
Yeah.
Something you don't want to do, you know God's serious.
Yeah. And so our knowledge is going to lead us to that commitment to obey, right? Exactly right. And so there is a standard that we measure ourselves to. It's not just a feeling. It's not just a personal decision. I think I'm good enough with God. No, that's not what John says. John says there is a standard, and that standard is the commandments. Are we keeping those things? And so knowing God equals obedience. John 15:10. If you obey me, my Father and I will remain in you, right? And so here he says in John 15 that for us to remain, Him to remain in us and us to remain in Him, right? That vine parable there at the beginning of chapter 15 in the Gospel of John, we've got to obey His commandments. And that means following Christ's example.
That includes baptism.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It involves obeying everything, right? Obeying our entrance into Christ and also how to remain in Christ, right? 1 John 1:7, that is to be consistent, to walk in the light as He is in the light. And so John uses the word abide. The Greek word there is meno. He uses that 24 times in 1 John. And so that's another big word for John, and he uses it there in John 15:10 in the Gospel of John. Meno is translated to abide or to remain. And so John sees this as extremely important for someone to abide in the teachings of Christ, which should also be translated to remain in the teachings of Christ. And so it's not up to us to say, oh, God and I have a relationship and He's going to be okay with me doing this. John says, remain, abide in the teaching, right? Remain. You said, how do we know? In the Scriptures, right? That's what John says. He says, abide in that teaching, right? And so as Christians, that's what we've got to do. He has a major emphasis on a believer's abiding in the relationship of Scripture. The obligation of every Christian is not just to obey God's orders, verses 3 and 4, but also to follow the example of His Son. Let's read verses 5 through 6. Let's see. Verses 5 through 6. But whoever keeps His word, in him the love of God truly is perfected. By this we may know that we are in Him. Whoever says he abides in Him ought to walk the same way in which He walked. And so if someone says, I know God, I have a relationship with Him, what should they be showing in their daily walk?
Christ-like example.
Yeah, Christ. Who's the Him in this passage? Is it Christ or God?
They're the same.
They're the same. But I think here the emphasis is on Christ, right? Because the emphasis here is being obedient to the Father. If you look in the Gospel of John, various times throughout that Gospel, Jesus explicitly says, I have kept all the things that you have given me to do. And if Christ, the Son of God, the Redeemer of mankind, had to obey God's commandments and His wills and His wants and His wishes, what does that say for you and I as Christians, followers of Christ? We should expect to do the same thing, right? And yet there are so many people under the umbrella of Christianity who believe that Christ had to be subservient to the Father, but I don't have to be. Or they have an idea that's different of what subservience means. And they define that through feeling, thinking, I believe. But what does John say, the apostle of love? That's right. That's right. You've got to do something, right? Christianity is not something you are, it's something you do, right? And so, which then becomes who you are because you do it so much, right? But so many times people like to think in abstract, these ideas, right? It's just this thing. It's not a thing. It's who you are. It's what you do in every situation of life. And so he continues on with this new commandment in verses 7 through 11. Let's go ahead and read that passage together. Verses 7 through 11. Beloved, I am writing to you a new commandment, not a new commandment, but an old commandment that you had from the beginning. The old commandment is the word that you have heard. At the same time, it is a new commandment that I am writing to you, which is true in Him and in you, because the darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining. Whoever says he is in the light and hates his brother is still in darkness. Whoever loves his brother abides in the light and in him, and there is no cause for stumbling. But whoever hates his brother is in the darkness and walks in the darkness and does not know where he is going because the darkness has blinded his eyes. In verses 7 through 8, he talks about an old commandment and a new commandment. Where is the old commandment listed? Am I going to have to bring the candy back out, guys? I know all of you have already seen on the screen, right? Old Testament, right? Are y'all guys looking at the PowerPoints? Where's the old law at? Leviticus, right? Leviticus what? 19:18. Y'all get some more sleep, okay? Y'all are sluggish. You know what Brittany does to her middle schoolers when they're sluggish? Burpees. Burpees. If you don't know what those are, you don't want them, okay? So, answer questions. Okay, all right. It's an old commandment, right? God has always commanded His people to love each other. But it's become new and afresh. In John 13:33 through 35, we see how that becomes new. How does it change from Leviticus 19:18 to John 13:35? What does John do in John 13? You know, don't be shy. That's exactly right. He washes the disciples' feet. The rabbi, right, the master, the teacher, gets down and he washes their feet, an action that would have been reserved for one of the lower of the servant class. Jesus does that. Then He instructs them at the very end, and He says, as I have loved you, you ought to love one another. Right? Leviticus 19, love your neighbor as yourself. Right? Love each other. Jesus takes that old commandment and He quantifies it, makes it so much greater because He has a qualifier that goes with it. He says, you love each other as I have loved you. So how are we supposed to love each other in the church? Who's our standard? Christ, right? Because He loved us, right? So our standard is Christ. So I ask you, how are you loving your brothers and sisters in this congregation? Do you think you love them as much as Christ loved the disciples? Or as much as Christ loved the church? Maybe. Maybe not. If not, there's room to grow, right? Because that's what we've been called to be. Well, Isaac, I can never love somebody as much as Christ loves something. I mean, that's just ridiculous. Well, that's what we're called to do. And so we might die trying to love each other as much as Christ, but that's what we've been called to do, to love each other in a way that the Son of God loved us. He has become our standard. And so that's what John tells these Christians, is that if you want to know that you know God, if you want to know that you're in a relationship with God, you've got to keep His commandments. And oh, by the way, let me reinforce one while I'm talking about commandments. Love each other. Right? When you come to church, smile, shake hands, and love each other. And if somebody's in need, reach out to each other. If somebody's got to have a surgery or whatever it is, show that person that you love them and that you're thinking about them. And if we can do that, then we will love each other just as Christ loved the church, because love overtakes darkness. It's interesting because he plays on a theme that he uses throughout the very first chapter of the Gospel of John. In that first chapter in the Gospel of John, he mentions light and darkness. And he uses that in verse 5, verse 9, and also in chapter 8, verse 12, about how love overtakes darkness. And here he says that love, the love that we have for each other, is the same way. Now, how do you think that love overtakes non-love, like light overtakes darkness?
Culture of action.
Yeah, absolutely, Brother Ed. And that's what the whole section is about, right? Love is an action, right? If you said, Miss Joy, I love you, and then mistreated her, right? First of all, we all know Miss Joy, and that wouldn't be a good thing, okay? No? Wouldn't be a good thing? No. Trust me, Brittany's the same way. So if we tell our spouses we love them and don't back that up with actions, it means nothing, right? You know, it's void. So we need to do stuff. We need to do actions. John says the same thing with our walk as Christians.
But don't be called through the actions without having love. It's also apparent.
Oh, absolutely. No, the love has to motivate the actions, right?
They help together and intertwine.
Oh, absolutely. Without statement, right? I mean, to not have the love and do the action would be, I guess it'd be repetitive. I would get tired of it eventually, to be honest with you. There's got to be a motivator, right? And so if you're doing actions and your motivation is not love, then what is your motivations? Is it selfishness? Is it manipulation? So yeah, there are different motivators, right? But that our action has to be coupled with that love. Absolutely. Absolutely. And so that's what John is stressing here in this passage, that we have got to love each other just as Christ loved the church. Love is an action. And he puts that into application and practice. How does he do that in verses 9 through 11? He takes an abstract idea like love, but he makes it more personable and more personified in verses 9 through 11. What does he say?
Black and white.
Okay. How so?
Light and dark.
Light and dark, right? How else does he qualify those things? Spiritual brothers, right? Yeah. Yeah. It's one thing to say love each other, right? I mean, we can say in a sermon, love God, love each other, and Ron did a fantastic job of that last week. And he qualified that, right? He did a good job of qualifying what that looks like. But a lot of people will say, how do you know that you love God? Well, I just love God. Well, what does that look like? Well, I just know. Well, that's not good enough for John, because John told us in the previous section that if you're going to love God, you better be doing something, right? You better be keeping His commands. Well, now he says you got to love each other. Oh, I love my church family. What do you do? Is it just an idea? Is it a feeling you have in your chest? Or is it something you do? Look at how John uses both of these in this section. Verses 3 through 6, he says, love God, do something. Keep His commands, right? Love your brother and sister and do things, right? Take care of them. Don't speak bad about them. Do you see how he kind of lays those two side by side? Right? It's not good enough for John just to say, oh yeah, I've got that. He says, no, how are you doing it? How are you manifesting it so others can see it? Because love is manifested through actions. And then I took this from RG3. His said, no love, no peace. I've got no love, no God. Right? If you K-N-O-W love, then you K-N-O-W God. If you N-O love, you N-O God. Do y'all get what I tried to do there? I thought it was pretty witty. Personally. Like I said, I did steal that, but I took peace and changed it with God. So it's not originally mine, but I thought it was pretty good. We've got to have that motivation in our lives. If we want to love God, then we've got to love each other. If we don't love our brothers and sisters in Christ, why would that be a bad thing? Why is that detrimental? Number one, we're not following the commandments, right? We got to love because we've been commanded to love. What are some of the practical reasons why we should do that?
You gotta love to have compassion.
Yes. Yes. You've got to love to have compassion. When people are hurting, they say things that they really don't mean. Sometimes they lash out. I remember when I was a kid, somebody would say something mean, or, and mom would say, well, they're in pain. And what she was trying to say is when people are hurting, they do things, they say things they wouldn't normally do because it's the pain. And so as someone who loves them, you realize that, and you have compassion. And you treat them a little softer, more gently than maybe you would in a different circumstance. But you got to love to have compassion, right? Why else is it important for us to love our brothers and sisters? Compassion is definitely one. It's a commandment, right? We've got that. What else, though? I'm talking more practical things. That's right. If you don't love your brother who you can see, how can you love God who you can't see? Right? Absolutely. Absolutely.
Jesus' earnest prayer in John 17 was that of unity.
Yeah.
If you don't have love, the unity is not going to abound within the community.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you see that in 1 Corinthians, right? Their love had grown cold. That's why, what does Paul, talk about in 1 Corinthians 13? Love. Why does he do that? Because they're fighting over spiritual gifts. Right? Their love for each other is missing, and so they've got divisions. Absolutely. So for compassion and for unity, what else? Why else do we need love here at this congregation?
We're also supposed to bear each other's burdens. So
Yeah.
love each other and how you want to even know what someone's going through or care enough to do that for them or help them through sin or whatever it is that they're going through.
We've got to bear each other's burdens. If we don't love each other, well, we're not going to be around each other. And if we're not around each other, we don't know what we're dealing with, what we're struggling with. We're not going to care. If you don't love somebody, then you're not going to care what their struggles are, at least not enough to do something about it. So yeah, we've got to bear each other's burdens, and that takes love.
Parental love encourages the child.
Mm-hmm.
It strengthens the child, helps the child grow, brings the child to maturity. As a Christian, we should be considering each other in the same aspects.
Yeah.
Just as the Father considers us with His love.
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the things that I took from that, Billy Wayne, is that that parental love, right? You love them, and you do those things for maturity. You said maturity purposes. Should I expect a Christian to act, talk, walk the same way after 2 weeks out of the baptistry as I've been for, preaching 10 years, or if you've been a Christian for 50 years? If you do, that says more about you than it does them. Okay, if you want someone that's been wet for 2 weeks to act just like you, and then you've been stalling for the last 20 years. You know what I'm saying? So now that doesn't mean they just get away with everything, right? But that love, right? That love. So when they say something wrong, sweet little girl, she'd been a Christian not very long, and she would say something about pastor or something like that. She's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." I'm like, "That's fine. Like you're changing your whole religious system. Like there's going to be some terminology you're going to say. It's okay, right?" I mean, I didn't have to jump on her and be like, "Now listen here, like I'm not a pastor." You know what I'm saying? It's like, whoa, man, come on. She's been a Christian for 2 weeks. Like, let's calm down. And so it's important for us to love for that maturity. What else?
The Great Commission. It's going to be hard to go forth and bring people to Christ if you don't show love for them.
Yeah.
You don't care about them.
Exactly. When you love somebody, like you're saying, Michael, when you love them and they're lost, it motivates you, right? I mean, it's sad when anybody loses their soul, but when it's a loved one, that motivation is a little bit different, right? And so absolutely, but it also, for those of us in the church, it makes us more watchful for their situation, right? We could say, well, I don't really care if they fall away or if they come or leave, whatever, I don't care. Well, if you don't, where's that love, right, that we're supposed to have for each other? What else? Anybody have another one?
We're supposed to correct each other when we fall off.
Yeah. One I was thinking about was forgiveness and correction. If we don't have love, we're not going to correct the right way. As Christians, we are commanded to correct each other, but in love, right? And if we don't have that love, that correction is not going to have the fruit that it's supposed to have. But also on the other end for forgiveness, right? Well, that person wronged me. Well, they may have. And we may need to work on that. And that's completely valid. But if we love somebody, that forgiveness is going to be more pertinent than it is if we didn't have a relationship with them, right? We're more apt to try to seek reconciliation with our kids than maybe just some guy in Walmart we don't like. Why? Well, because you're going to be around them. Like Thanksgiving and Christmas is coming up. There's stuff. There's emotions, right? We should have that in the church too, right? And so that love seeks that correction and that forgiveness. Absolutely. If we don't have love, none of those things take place. We don't care about people's maturity. We don't care about bearing burdens. We don't care about people's spiritual state. We don't care about correcting in love. We just want to correct. We don't care about offering forgiveness or trying to think about things from others' perspective. Those things just go out the window if you don't have one thing in place. That's love. That's why, right? Jesus said the two main commandments were love God and love each other. That's why John says, "I give you an old but new commandment. Love each other as Christ has loved you." Because it's the focal point of everything that we do. But it's also the focal point of us being faithful to God by obeying Him because of that motivation that we have in love. And then we have here in verses 12 through 14, Paul talks about the three types of people who were in the assembly there. Let's look at verses 12 through 14 together. It says, "I am writing to you, little children, because your sins are forgiven for His name's sake. I am writing to you, fathers, because you know Him who is from the beginning. I am writing to you, young men, because you have overcome the evil one. And I write to you, children, because you know the Father. I write to you, fathers, because you know him who is from the beginning. And I write to you, young men, because you are strong, and the word of God abides in you, and you have overcome the evil one. Now, what is interesting, especially, now the last triplet is a little bit different with the young men, but the first two are pretty much the exact same thing repeated. Why is that? Doesn't that feel a little unnecessary? Emphasis? Absolutely. And the one thing that we don't see here in the English text that's different in the Greek text, the same words are used for the verbs on all those, correct? So it looks like it's repeating. The first section of 3 has the present tense, sim, which is like a continuous, right? Something that you are actively, continually doing, right? The second triplets have the aorist tense, which is a defined point. And so what he is showing here is that there are people in the congregation. He may be referring to the same ones. He may be referring to 2 subgroups, right? Little children who are starting the process of knowing God, knowing the Father, and those who are little children who know the Father. Or he may be saying that you were learning at one time, and now you know. Same thing, you fathers, right? He says the same thing. He says, because you have overcome the fathers, you have known him from the beginning. First set is a present tense. That continuous action, right? You've been knowing him. You've been learning. You've been growing. The second triplet, because you know him, right? It's defined. It's a point. And so he could be emphasizing the maturity here. He could be talking about 2 separate groups of people. And the young men that you see that, they're overcoming. They're currently overcoming. And then that last one he says, you have overcome, right? You've fought your spiritual battles, you're won, and you're strong. The interesting thing is that the word strong here in Greek is Nikaio, and that's where we get Nike from. And so Nike was the Roman god of victory. And so, but the Greek word here means like strong young man, if you're strong, you're victorious. And so the interesting thing here is that John uses that word 24 times. It's only used 28 times in the New Testament. So John is very concerned about being strong, about conquering. Same word translated conquerors, right? And so here the verbiage here is only used in chapter 5, verse 4 for victory, for us overcoming the victory. So the gospel of love is extremely concerned about your obedience. And he says here that if you are obedient in a loving way, you will be victorious. That's why John's going to talk about a little bit later, knowing that you have salvation. Right? And people talk about all the time, well, Isaac, how do you know? I know John says you should know, but how do you know? Because I have a hard time having that much confidence in my salvation. And John says if I don't have that confidence, then I'm not living my life as I should live. And so, but how do we know? Well, for John, it's simple. If you love God and you obey God, you will win. And so John reiterates that throughout his epistles, that we are in this spiritual battle together, and that with Christ on our side, that we're going to win. If we don't love God, there is a second option for us at the table. And what is that option? The world. Thank you, Miss Julia. All right. The second option at the table is loving the world. Sounds nice. There's a lot of pretty things in the world, but let's look what John has to say about that. Verse 15 through 17. Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, the pride of life, is not from the Father, but from the world. And the world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever. The New Testament uses the word cosmos, or world, in 3 different ways. Sometimes it refers to the physical earth, like in Acts 17:24. Sometimes it refers to all of mankind, like in John 3:16. And sometimes, like it does here, it refers to the world's culture. Different places have different cultures, but there is a world culture, if you will. There is a way of the world. It entices all of us. It is attractive. It gives pleasure in various aspects in different ways. And all people are somehow, maybe in different ways, attracted to this worldly culture that is put in front of us by Satan. It has a values and a sense of loyalty. Satan controls the system. John chapter 12, verse 31 and 14, verse 30. And John will also talk about that in this epistle in chapter 5, verse 19. And so, yes.
Matthew 6:33, I like that verse.
What does it say?
Put the kingdom first, and then all these other things.
Absolutely, right? That focus. And so we've got to be able that we're putting the kingdom first and not the world, right? And so if we put the kingdom first, we're going to have that love and that obedience. But if we can still come to church and have the world first in our lives, right? A preacher told me a long time ago, worship is not work. Work is not worship. If you think you're coming to worship and fulfilling your work as a Christian, and you got it all wrong. Right? We worship on Sunday. We work on Monday through Saturday. Right? And there's a lot of Christians that sometimes forget that work and worship is not the same thing. Right? We've been called to do both. You can't skip one or the other. Right? You can't work Monday through Saturday for the Lord and skip church on Sunday. Say, I've been living for Him all week. I don't have to go to church. We'd say, oh, yes, you do. But some people say, well, I go to church on Sunday. I have to live for Him on Monday through Saturday. Well, yes, you do. Right? And so, yeah, we've got to have that work, right? That obedience is what John is talking about. And so we can go to church on Sundays and live for the world the rest of the week. That can't be us either. And so that tells us that if we love the world, that we're anti-God. In fact, James would tell us that loving the world is enmity with God. Or no, that's John, I'm sorry. And so that is manifested by lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, and the pride of life, and Satan is in control.
So the Bible expressed faith as works of.
Yeah. James, right? James talks about, show me your faith apart from your works, and I'll show you my faith by my works. Right? And he talks about not being a hearer who just hears, but a doer who hears and does.
Don't he call faith works as it works as, but at the same time he calls faith works, but that not mean that is really look at it.
Yeah. I'd have to look for that specific passage. I think I know what you're talking about, but I'm drawing a blank. If someone else wants to look that up, you can, and let us know in class.
I can show you my faith by my works.
Yeah. Yeah, faith that word James, right? James. And so, is that the passage you're thinking of, Brother Smith? Okay. But you're right. I mean, we've got to be sure that we're not living for the world. The lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, the pride of life, direct three different things. The lust of the eyes is to desire to have something apart from the will of God. The desires of the eyes is to acquire something that's apart from the will of God. And the pride of life is to be something that it transgresses what God's will is for us in our life. And it's important for us not to put our stock right in the world. Right? Think about Matthew 6. Think about what Jesus says pretty close to that passage where He says, don't put your treasures on the earth where thieves break in and steal and moth and rust decay. Put your treasures up in heaven. Right? And so why is it important for us not to put our treasures, our passion in the world? It's passing away, right? And the world's going to burn up. And so are all those lusts. And if that's where you've put your life, if that's where you've put your stock, if that's where you put your soul, guess where your soul's going to be? Right in the middle of that fire.
The strongest bond any man can possess to acquire what God intended over time is to invest in the Lord's work in whatever means you can find possible. Whether it be encouraging someone who is studying, giving to the elderly that may not have it, that are shut in, or spending time investing with someone to help them grow to maturity. Whatever you can invest in the kingdom, that's what your return value is going to be.
Oh, absolutely, right? When Peter...
That's your surety.
Yeah.
God is recognizing what you're doing, that you're going to have reward for it.
Yeah. Well, Peter asked Jesus that question. Lord,
everything else is vanished.
yeah, he says, Lord, what are we going to get? And he says, I surely tell you, anybody that's left, house or father or mother or lands will receive much more in the kingdom of heaven. And so Kevin's playing with the bell back there. But so the conclusion for the three things that we see here in this passage is that love demands obedience, right? The Christian world has gotten this wrong. It's not a thought. It's not a feeling. Loving God is obeying God. John 14:15. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. The second thing that John stresses here is that if you love God, then you will love His family, the church, and the members that make up that family. Now, is that a sticky situation sometimes? Yeah, look at your own personal families, right? Look at mine. Yeah, sometimes that's a little weedy, right? It takes some effort, some time, but that's what God's called us to do. Because if we didn't have that love, this wouldn't work. There's too many different opinions. There's too many different personalities. There's too many different ways that people think things ought to be done. It would never work, right? But if love is at the center, we can work through those things. We've got to have that in place. And loving the world leads to destruction, but loving God leads to eternity. And that's the three things that John wants us to take away. Thank you so much for your comments, your attendance. Let's close with prayer. Dear God, thank you so much for this day and for all the many blessings you've given us. We're so thankful for your word, for your instruction, and for your teaching. Dear Heavenly Father, please help each individual that is here this morning to love you, and for that love to be more than just mere words, but for that love to manifest itself in obedience to you and your word, and our thoughts and our actions and the way we live our lives. Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for the grace of the grace that you have given us through your Son. Dear Heavenly Father, please help us to walk the way in which He walked and to live a life that glorifies you and the dark world that we live in. Dear Heavenly Father, please help us to be that light that will shine your glory in this community and also bring others to you. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.